Today I will be discussing about one of the CSS preprocessor called Sass. The Sass stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. It is a platform independent preprocessor. Sass is an extension to CSS. Sass provides features like variables, mixins, nested rules, imports, inheritance, built-in functions and much more cool things. In short, Sass is a very powerful and much useful when compared to CSS. Let's see few examples on how to use Sass, or basically why do you need a CSS preprocessor. First, I'll open the VS Code, that is the Visual Studio Code, and you can see I have an HTML file defined already. It's just a boilerplate code. Now you can see here extensions. I'll click on it and here we have to download the live Sass compiler in order to execute the .scss file. I'll install it. Now this will compile the Sass files into CSS. Because the browser cannot actually read the Sass files, it only reads the CSS files. Now here let me give an H1 with some random text. There you can see it in the browser. Now let's give some color to this text using Sass. So instead of creating the .css file, I will create the .scss file. You can either give the .sass as well, but it's all the same. Typically we see that the .scss is used more. I will give a class here to h1 saying text. Now let's give some styling to this. Let's check the browser. You can see there is no change applied. Why? Because browser cannot read the Sass files. Now in order to compile the Sass files to CSS, you can see the option here in the status bar showing watch Sass. I'll click on it. Now if you see here, two files have been created, that is .css and .map. So as I mentioned before that the Sass compiler will compile the Sass file to CSS so that the browser can read it. If I click on the CSS file, you can see it is exactly the same as Sass file. Let's add the link here saying style.css. Now if I go to the browser, you can see the styling is now applied. Let's try to display this text in different colors. I'll copy this H1 5 more times, changing the class name as well. Let's go to Sass file and I'll copy these stylings. You can see all these texts have same size, color and font. Now what if I want to apply different size to few text or different font or maybe color? Traditionally, I will have to go through all these stylings options individually and change them, which seems doable right now, but let's say you have a bigger project and many text options are there. Then you cannot go through individual options and change the settings. You can do it, but it becomes a huge task. This is where the Sass comes in. It provides us a functionality called variables. This is how you define them. I'll say $font dash size colon 2.3 em. I'll define another variable saying $new dash font fantasy. So here I am able to define variables in the Sass file. In CSS you do not have provision to have variables, but eventually it is the CSS which is getting executed. So make sure that your Sass file is converted to CSS to see the final changes. Now let's say I want to change this text font size. I'll simply give the variable name that we defined, that is $font size. Maybe change the font family too. I'll say $new font here. Let's change the color as well. I will give another variable saying $base blue. I'll give blue color here. And second color variable saying $color dash red, giving the red color here. Let's give the color to the text by simply giving the variable name. Now if I check the browser, you can see the changes. So this is what Sass is capable of. It's very useful when there are complex situations which CSS cannot handle. One more thing I would like to discuss is that, like here you can define the variables like this, but when you are working on the bigger projects, best way is to create different file for the variables. I will create a file here called variable.scss and will copy all the variables which we have defined here. And in here, in order to utilize the variables, I'll say @import and I will give the file path, that is variables.scss. Now if I check the output, you can see there is no change. In the next section, I'll be covering the mixins concept of Sass, so stay tuned.